we can go to the next keynote speaker. The next keynote speaker would be Fabiana Zollo, that is a researcher investigate information and misinformation spreading, social dynamic, and the emergence of collective narratives online. She authored several papers of impact of great impact on these topics, and since 2019, she has been serving as an external expert to the European Food Safety Authority, and in 2020, she joined the task force data science at AGCOM, the Italian Communication Regulatory Authority. So today she will talk about polarization, misinformation, and hate online. And it's really a pleasure for us to have you here, Fabiana, and the floor is yours whenever you want.
Thank you very much for this introduction, and just sharing the presentation. Can you just confirm that you can see it, right?
Everything is okay, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so as you said, so in my, let's say in this talk, I will try also to show how we can use online data to investigate social dynamics in general, and I will mainly talk about, of course, polarization and misinformation and hate speech, which is one of the topics I've been investigating recently. So I won't go in lots of details of the different papers, but of course we have then some time for questions if you have any questions. So just to let's say just to have everything in context, I can talk quickly about the background and previous work that we did in the on polarization and misinformation dynamics on social media, because this is really also, I think it can help also to explain what we are doing now, and so what we are trying to do to contrast the phenomenon. So we already talked a bit about polarization with Alberto, and we were also mentioning echo chambers. So these are now, I would say, keywords that are always related to social media, more in generally, but as Alberto was pointing out, and I agree, this is not a problem of social media platforms. Of course, echo chambers were theorized even before. What we did was to measure this. So we, thanks to social media data, we have the opportunity to measure this phenomena more easily using the data that as users we live on social media platforms. And what we, so by analyzing this data, what emerged is that especially when we are in front of very controversial issues that can be not only pseudoscience or political debates, but also, for example, vaccination. And now we are experimenting this with this pandemic. So more general, whenever we have a very controversial issue, what we observed in different settings and also on different platforms is that users seem to polarize around these topics. And what we also observed is that in most cases we can find the presence of the so-called echo chambers. So these groups of users who keep reinforcing their narrative and their worldview, and most importantly, they ignore, let's say, tend to ignore what's outside of this group of like-minded individuals. So of course, these dynamics, so it's interesting to study these dynamics. There are also using the data from social media platforms, echo chambers are something that emerge very often. It's also true that not we always talk about social media using this very general term, social media, that indeed refer to a variety of platforms. And this is also an important, I think, point to make, because of course it also depends on how the platform works, and also not only in terms of functionalities, but also in terms, for example, of the users on the platforms and so on. And indeed, what recent findings are showing is that, for example, echo chambers seem to be more present on platforms that employ algorithms that are reinforcing the cognitive mechanism of users in choosing and selecting information adhering to their worldviews. So, for example, like, I don't know, the newsfeed algorithm in Facebook. What we have also observed is that not only so users in these settings tend to confine their attention to a particular set of, for example, information sources, but also that the number of these information sources tend to decrease for increasing level of activity of the users and longevity of the users on the platform. So, and this is an important observation, because of course, basically we believe that thanks to the internet, we have access to this wide variety of information and pretty infinite information. But in the end, what we observe is that sometimes the users tend to focus on and to get information and get informed from a very small set of news sources. And this, especially, of course, in democratic settings, is something that is worth investigating, because, of course, it can also affect pluralism, for example, in a democracy. We have also been investigating the emotional dynamics, so how the users who are, for example, participating to these groups, polarized groups, how they interact also in terms of the sentiment that they expressed. And what we found in this work, this was a work from 2015, what we were observing there was that the sentiment of the users in the discussion was going towards negative values for increasing level of polarization of the users, and also that when we had users coming from opponent communities, this discussion was a discussion that tended to degenerate towards very negative values. And this is something that I can anticipate that we can also observe more recently, focusing on hate speech, as I will show you later. So in all this context, and also in terms of misinformation, so I think it's important to take into account the fact that when we are on social media platforms, we can have all these mechanisms that are in play. And this is important when we want to address and to contrast misinformation. And I think that Alberto before me made some very important points, and some of them I totally agree with him. Of course, the first main point is that misinformation is not a phenomenon that is just related to social media platforms. Of course, this context and the context of social media and the internet is a very different context from the more traditional media system. And on the other side, we also have much more data, and we have much more possibilities to investigate this information space. And so much of the results are focusing on this for this reason. But on the other side, one of the main approaches that have been applied so far against misinformation are based on debunking fact-checking approach. So the idea of correcting information. I think that we have some drawbacks of these approaches. The first one is that we do not have this kind of approaches require lots of time and resources. And of course, when you have information that can spread very fast and very easily on the internet and social media, if that's a piece of misinformation, I mean, the time that you need to produce debunking or fact-checking content may be too much to contrast that piece of information. And so this cannot be for sure the only approach that we adopt and we put in place to try to contrast the phenomenon. On the other side, the problem is that when we have a very polarized structure like the one that I was describing, the risk is that these corrections are not reaching the target because you have a structure that is so polarized that makes those attempts ineffective. Not because, so we have also observed that in some cases they can also act and produce a backfire effect. But more important, I would say the very important problem is to reach these communities and these targets. And so the idea is that, so the question is, so what we can do to try to contrast this information and to and to find solutions to this problem, because of course we know that misinformation can be, I mean, and then we know that we have very different shades, and the definition of misinformation is not so straightforward, but of course it can have some impact on people, and we have seen this, for example, in this pandemic. So in terms of countermeasures, what we have also observed is that misinformation and polarization seem to be very intertwined. And so what we have observed is that maybe instead of, let's say, tackling misinformation directly, so like producing debunking content or fact-checking or, I don't know, removing misinformation and so on, what we can try to do is to, on one side, to anticipate the phenomenon, and on the other side, to try to address the needs of the users and the concerns of the users by producing quality information that we can disseminate in the online environment, and so to adapt also the communication strategies on controversial issues, so that we can try to make, let's say, this kind of content less attractive for misinformation and disinformation sources. We had the first work in this direction, where we kind of developed this model that was focusing on the concept of the early warning. So the idea that instead of focusing on the content itself, we can look at how users are interacting with this content, and through a series of metrics that were based on this information, we were able to kind of predict what kind of topics would be likely to be subject to misinformation in the short term. So imagine that we have a system like this. The idea is that maybe you can adjust the communication strategies on those topics, so that you can try to smooth polarization and to facilitate a different kinds of discussion on the social media platforms. And in this direction, we did a first experiment with the London School of Economics and Corriere della Sera. Corriere della Sera, for non-Italian participants today, is the main newspaper that we have in Italy. And in this project, what we did was to, so the idea was to try to understand if the way in which users and readers respond to the journalistic outputs also depends on the technique and the content type that is chosen to present that kind of information. So not on the content itself, not on the news itself, but on how the journalist decides to present the news. So what we did together with the journalists was, okay, here we were in this, the topic was the topic of migration. We are here before the pandemic. Migration was one of the hot topics that we had in Italy on the newspaper's agenda and also political agenda. So we asked the journalists whenever they had to publish a migration-related story from March to November 2018 to, of course, they were free to choose the content of the news, but we asked them to try to use a variety of content types and techniques. And we tracked, we used the data from Facebook to track the engagement of the users and to track the sentiment of the comments. We also had a manual annotation of all the comments to assign three labels. The first was on the toxicity. So we wanted to understand if the discussion that was going on was, so the language used was some kind of aggressive and unreasonable language. Then the mistrust, because we wanted to use this as a kind of proxy for trust of the news source, and the position of migration. And we used all this information and we analyzed the results to understand if we could be, we were able to observe any differences. And this is what we found. The multimedia pieces, so the pieces where you had some text and also images, sometimes videos, where the kind of content that elicited the more strong and supportive engagement from the users. But anytime that the journalists were using content types that were pushing facts to the forefront, like, for example, infographics. And this is also something that is also very common, for example, in some debunking strategies. This kind of activity was generating lots of debate, lots of discussion, and lots of pushback from anti-migration voices, and high criticism of the media. So the news source, in this case, Corriere della Sera, was not trusted. And the lowest level of criticism was with videos. In terms of techniques, if the technique used was kind of writing the, let's say, apparently straightforward, impartial, unemotional news report, this is the kind of technique that elicited the most trust. And this was a kind of surprise also for the journalists. The human interest stories, these were the stories where the journalists were reporting the news by trying to tell the story of the migrant or the group of migrants. So to kind of, create empathy with these people, why they have to leave their country and to reach Italy, all the problems and difficulties they had to deal with. And in this case, we had we measured and observed lots of toxic comments, lots of anti-migration comments, lots of media criticism. So this kind of stories was not really helpful to shape a more, let's say, civic debate around the topic. And in general, this was the case anytime the journalists were providing strong opinions or policy proposals, or pushing data and facts, as I was saying before. So of course, these are just, this is an example, this is a study focusing on Italy, so specific countries on a specific topic, that is the one of migration, which was anyway a very polarizing issue at the moment. But I think it's also useful to derive some insights also on the fact that sometimes it's not only the content itself, but on social media, it can also be how you decide to present this content to the public and to engage with the public on the platform. And so what we also have done recently, always in the direction of trying to find ways in which we can create and improve, let's say, the overall quality of information on social media platforms. And so to try to contrast misinformation in this way was to work on science communication. So I'm pretty sure that nowadays, during the pandemic, we are now, everyone is pretty aware of how much and how important is science communication in our society. This project is an European project that started much before the pandemic and finished last year. And what we did here was on one side, we analyzed the data from social media platforms to understand how science is communicated in different European countries and in these 3 different platforms, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. Also focusing on 3 controversial topics: artificial intelligence, climate change, and vaccines. And now vaccines are also a hot topic in this period. And what we did was to use this data together with some more qualitative studies that we did in the project to produce some recommendations for communicating science on social media, and to pay attention to the quality of the communication, but on the other side, also to being able to make this kind of communication effective. And so to do this, we used both insights from the quantitative analysis and the qualitative analysis, and we produced these recommendations that were tested for a period of 5 months on social media platforms with the help of science communication practitioners in Italy and in Europe. And in the end, with their help, we refined the recommendations. So if you are interested, maybe here we have lots of researchers and scientists. So if you are interested also in communicating science or your research on social media platforms, you can reach our website and download all the tools that we have created and are publicly available on the platforms. And so if you want any recommendations for improving the quality of content on social media platforms. Okay, so now I will use this last 15 minutes that I have to focus a bit more on a recent work that we have done on the hate speech, also to show how we can use data from social media platforms to investigate this phenomena, and also maybe to highlight some of the challenges that we can have. So this work is part of another European project that is called INSIP, and this project finished in May this year. So the goal of the project were different. So on one side we had to develop classifiers, so machine learning models for the detection of hate speech in different languages. There was also a part of the project and other teams that were focusing on the triggers and counter narratives against hate speech. And we also aimed to propose some policies to the European communication regulators, and the Italian Communications Authority, Agicom, was part of this project. Today I will talk more specifically about one of the studies that we did, where we wanted to investigate the possible relationship between misinformation and the use of a toxic language. So in this case, for example, the first challenge that we have in the project was to define hate speech. Of course, this definition was also really important for the development of the classifiers for the automatic detection of this kind of language. So in the end, we decided to use a more, let's say, relaxed definition of hate speech. So we decided to have different a spectrum of, so to analyze the whole spectrum of language. So from normal acceptable to the extreme violent language. So the violent speech is the speech that covers what we can really define as hate speech in terms of illegal speech. But we also decided to consider inappropriate and offensive speech. So this kind of speech is not illegal, but in our opinion, it can deteriorate the public debate, can foster radicalization, can foster polarization. So we decided to include also these other shades of the language in our study. In this study, we focused on YouTube, and we used Italian data from YouTube on COVID. We have this data collection, and we also categorized the different channels on YouTube in reliable channels and questionable channels. So questionable channels are what we can just more easily call misinformation, and in this case we used the information that the Italian Communications Authority provided. The AGCOM is usually working and so together with debunking and fact-checking organization for this kind of definitions. So what we did was, so the first thing that we had to do was to develop the model, and so to do this, we employed a supervised classification model. It means that you need some manual annotation that you will use to train the model and the classifier. So we had this manual annotation with a group of human annotators of more than 70,000 comments. And this is the annotation schema that the annotators had in front of them. So they had to classify each comment as either appropriate or inappropriate, offensive or violent. We provided the definitions, we provided examples, and the annotators could also rely on the research team for any doubts or questions. At the end of this task, what we have is this first set of comments that are manually annotated, and then we can use these comments to train the classifier and to validate the classifier. So in this case, so in the case of hate speech, and this is also the case, for example, if we think about sentiment analysis, or whenever we have a task that is inherently subjective, so even sometimes human annotators are not really able to agree with one another because they have this different perspective on how to classify a certain piece of text. And so what we decided to do was to let's say, integrate this part of uncertainty in the model, and so we, of course, kept track of the agreement between the annotators, and we use the same metrics to evaluate our model, and our model was able to let's say, simulate the performance of a human annotator. We have so the human annotators were agreeing more or less in the 80% of cases, and our model was able to replicate this behavior. So we can say that we have a high quality model that is able to assign these labels to the entire set of comments. So then we can analyze the data that we have, and and so the first thing that we can notice is that if we look at how these different toxic language labels are distributed in the data set, what we can see is that there is no particular differences in the language that is used on questionable channels, so misinformation channels, and unreliable channels. Also in terms of comments delay, so we measured how much time elapsed between the posting time of the video and that of the comment. So these delays are similar between questionable and reliable channels, but on questionable channels, toxic comments arrive first and faster than the appropriate ones. And this is something interesting that we could notice analyzing the data. The other very interesting result was that we were not able to find in our data set what you can we decided to call the pure haters. So people who are always using a violent language. What we instead found was that these are usually, let's say, common users that in some cases employ a inappropriate or inappropriate, offensive, or even hateful language. And of course, this is again, I think, also very important insight, because it tells us also an important piece of information, for example, to for policies in terms of contrasting, for example, of the hate speech. So it's not a phenomenon that can be just, related to a specific set of users, but tend to be something that we can observe for users that in general are not using this type of language. What we also observed was that in general, the users that we can define as more simple term, polarized. So the more the users were interacting mainly with one of the two information sources, on average, they were using a higher proportion of this kind of toxic language, and that users skewed towards reliable channels, so not towards misinformation, but towards reliable channels, were using a higher proportion of these comments than their opponents. The other interesting result is that some users mainly use this kind of comments in their opponents' community. And what we also observed here was that the toxicity of the debate, in terms of the overall toxicity, looking at the different comments that were part of the discussion, increases for increasing levels of for increasing length of discussion in terms of time and number of comments. So we find a positive correlation between toxicity and the length of discussion. This is something that we were already observing on Facebook in terms of sentiment, as I told you at the beginning of this talk. And here again, we are confirming this on another platform and in a different context, where we are going, let's say, more in depth in this negative sentiment, focusing more on toxicity and hate. So just to conclude this part, by making this analysis, we didn't find, any evidence of relationship between misinformation and using hate speech or violent, aggressive language. And again, what appears to be one of the main drivers also behind this speech seems to be polarization. And so again, trying to find also a way in which we can not get rid of polarization, because I don't think that's feasible, but to kind of improve the general debate and democratic debate also on these platforms can be one of the way that we have to improve the overall quality of this information space. And just for concluding, so we are working on this also. We are very focusing now also on the pandemics and not only the communication around vaccines, but more in general around infodemics and how we can tackle infodemics to promote more health information ecosystems. And we're doing this also in Ka Foscari. I am leading the team for Ka Foscari in this research coalition of great teams from other universities. And so if you're interested in these topics, and you can also visit the website of the coalition and keep in touch with us. I think my time is done, so thank you very much, and I'm open to address your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fabiana, for the really interesting talk and results. So again, if anyone in the audience of both the platform here and in Zoom and on WAS any question, just ask.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
Okay, thank you very much for your talk. I think we mostly agreeing on the majority of things, despite
Yes.
the terminology and my attempt to be provocative. But again, one thing that I would like to ask you, so I completely agree that with social media, we have like a great occasion to study, to have data and to study polarization dynamics in social media. And of course, they are present, they are there, and they are extremely important. I wanted to know what you think about the more general polarization dynamic in the world. So there is this idea now, beside the actual social media, but there is this idea that polarization is increasing everywhere. And I found this a bit questionable. Like, to me, it kind of depends from countries. So like in the US is probably, and we have some data that showed that polarization is increasing. But for example, we have the same here in UK, I think, but we have less in other European countries. And so it seems to not correlate with the social media usage. So I agree that, again, I'm talking about in general. So I agree that polarization is increasing maybe in US, but I mean, there are a lot of other things that happen in the US which are quite more worrying for me than the social media penetration. But like, I mean, we are now a few Italians, like political polarization in I don't know, in the 70s, people were literally killing each other from different parties. So saying that now polarization is increasing is for me a bit problematic. Again, this has nothing to do with the work on the social media. I think is interesting, but I wanted to know if you have any idea about that, or if it's something that have any influence in your research, because you can say, okay, no, I don't care, because anyway, in social media we have it. So
no, I think it's I think this is an important point, and I think it can be also sometimes it can be kind of bias, of course. So as I was saying before, so we are talking about social media, as one unique entity, but it's not like that. So when you focus on Facebook, it's very different than focusing, I don't know, on TikTok or other kinds of social media, and also like Telegram, for example.
yeah.
So I think that the problem sometimes is a kind of very, so sometimes we can see very, this straightforward generalization of a phenomenon that maybe are studied in a specific setting. Or so in the US, of course, polarization is also really there, not only on social media, but also in the population. I also believe that in other countries, so maybe it's not, a two-pole polarization. So you still have different groups and opponents, but in different, so it takes form differently. I think that maybe what, we can say that is a kind of a common trait among all these phenomena is maybe, of course, there is a fundamental, level sometimes of lack of trust in the institutions and so this can, of course, makes and there so you can observe, like this kind of defense of the entity of the group, like the same identity of the group. And this is something that we can also observe in different settings, and maybe in Italy, but not only in Italy, but of course, sometimes also in terms of during this pandemic, we have seen that having a position on one side or the other became, this kind of, having this polarization. But it's something that is not, so I wouldn't describe this to social media. As I said, of course, here we have data to measure sometimes the phenomenon, to understand, but it doesn't mean that this is a, a phenomenon that is just related to social media settings, of course. So what I was, I intended to say before is that, of course, we are in a totally different information system that has completely changed, how information spreads. And so this is something that we cannot ignore, but it's also very, I don't think that it's, that is So first of all, it's not evidence-based. And on the other side, I don't think it's right to say that misinformation, for example, is a problem of social media platforms. Of course, on social media platforms, when information spreads, bad or good, let's say, we can have, so the implications can be different. But again, for example, television, so the traditional media systems, we cannot say that are systems where misinformation is not present or polarization is not present, but it's very difficult to study this phenomena on large scale in these settings. But again, there are settings that I think play an important role in this. Of course, in terms of, and so that's why I also believe that instead, of fun, because what you were saying on the impact of misinformation, okay, and because we're always talking about misinformation, but in the end, what's the impact of disinformation? We don't know what's the impact of the online information, and what we also observe is that the amount of misinformation, as we can define misinformation for debunking, is very low. Okay, so the problem maybe it's also in how this system works, in the business model in this system, in how also official information sources, work in this. So that's why I told you, I think that we agree on lots of points here, because the problem is much more, it's much more complex. I don't think, to answer and close here to your question, I don't think that we can say that polarization increased, without having data and solid evidence for this. I think that sometimes we have this very strong, sometimes Western bias, where we have some insights for Europe, some European countries, or the US, and we tend to generalize this to everything.
Yeah. I mean, and especially in social media study, I think the US bias is a bit of a problem. So
yes,
it's good that
so that's
it's
why,
good that you're doing things in Italy, and
so that's why we were trying to, in some papers, also to make comparison across the different countries, or to compare the different platforms, because I think that this is really important. For example, also in the science communication project, having different countries, so you can really see the differences, and so also the recommendations in terms of what you can do really changes, not only according to the country, but also according to the platform, because Twitter is not Facebook and is not YouTube. So I think that we have to recognize this complexity, because otherwise what we put in place as also countermeasures cannot be effective.
Thank you, you both. I think we have then time for keeping discussing these things on the panel discussion. Thank you, Fabiana, again for your presentation. And now we can move to